The girl hadn't eaten in days. Her lips were cracked, her eyes rimmed red from dust and fear. Rough hemp rope bit into her wrists every time she tried to move. The sun over Dodge City showed no mercy that summer. It turned every inch of earth into fire. Even the wind burned when it touched her skin. She sat on the back of an old wooden wagon parked near the stockyard, barefoot, trembling, her dress torn and her dignity long gone. Men surrounded her, laughing like it was sport. They said she was lucky to still be alive. But Lydia Barnes didn't feel lucky. She felt like an animal waiting for someone to decide what to do with her. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. When she finally found her voice, it came out like a ghost. "Please make it quick," she begged. No one heard her, or maybe no one cared. The men were too busy arguing about her worth, trading jokes like she was livestock. Silas Boone, a thick man with a permanent sneer, waved a crumpled paper in the air. "She's not worth the food she eats," he barked. "Somebody take her before the marshal hears I'm selling more than cattle." The crowd snickered, half drunk, half cruel. Then a stranger stepped forward from the heat shimmer, his shadow cutting across the dirt. He was tall, built like a man who worked more than he spoke. His shirt clung to him, damp with sweat from a long ride. The hat brim hid most of his face, but his presence quieted the laughter around them. Elias McKenna, 56, rancher widower, known across the plains for his temper and for never taking company since his wife passed. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, hands resting near the worn belt where a wedding ring once hung. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and low. "How much?" Silas grinned, thinking he'd found another buyer. "She's got a mouth that don't know when to quit. Give me $1, and she's yours." A ripple of laughter rolled through the stockyard. A human life for $1. Elias reached into his pocket, pulled out a single silver coin, and dropped it on the barrel between them. The clink silenced everything. He didn't look at Lydia. He didn't touch her. He just said, "Get off that wagon." Lydia froze, unsure if he meant to kill her or spare her. Maybe this was mercy. Maybe this was what freedom sounded like in a place where souls were cheaper than horses. Her legs trembled as she stood, expecting pain instead of deliverance. Elias turned back to Silas. "Write a name on that paper," he said. "Make sure everyone sees this trade was yours." The laughter died. Even the wind seemed to pause. Silas hesitated, his confidence fading. "Why's it matter?" "Because," Elias said, voice cutting like a blade, "the law here says once money trades hands, it's a binding deal. That means your name's on record for selling another human being." The weight of those words sank in. The men who'd been laughing now shifted, glancing at each other uneasily. They all knew what that meant. Silas's hand shook as he scribbled his name across the page. Elias picked up the paper and folded it once, slipping it into his pocket. When Lydia realized what he'd done, her knees gave way. He hadn't bought her. He'd freed her. The yard went still, only the creak of a distant windmill breaking the silence. Elias stepped closer, not to comfort her, but to make sure she could stand. "You're done here," he said quietly. "Come on." She followed because she didn't know what else to do. Her body moved, but her mind lagged behind, still trapped in disbelief. The world beyond the stockyard looked the same, dry, endless, merciless, but somehow something had shifted. As they walked away, the men muttered behind them, half angry, half scared. Elias didn't look back once. He just adjusted his hat and kept walking toward his horse. Lydia stumbled behind, her feet raw, her heart pounding. When they reached the end of the road, she finally whispered, "Why did you do that?" Elias didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the horizon where the sun bled into the plains. "Because somebody had to," he said. Then he climbed onto his horse and nodded for her to follow. The day was fading fast, the sky burning red as blood. Lydia walked beside the horse, every step scraping dust in her wounds, every breath tasting like freedom, a word she still didn't understand. But one thing was certain. That single dollar had just changed everything. The road out of Dodge stretched like a scar across the earth, dust, wind, and nothing else for miles. Lydia walked beside Elias's horse, The rope burns on her wrists raw and red. Her thoughts tangled between disbelief and fear. She kept glancing up at him, half expecting him to turn around and say it was all a cruel joke. But he didn't. He just rode in silence, his face unreadable beneath the hat brim. She tried to speak, but her voice came out rough. "You could have left me there." Elias didn't look down. "Could have," he said. "Didn't." They kept moving until the sun started to melt into the horizon, the sky bleeding orange and violet. By the time they reached the Arkansas River, Lydia's legs were shaking so bad she thought she'd collapse. The river glimmered like silver glass, and the breeze carried a hint of coolness, something that almost felt like kindness after all that heat. Elias stopped his horse and dismounted without a word. He set down his saddlebag, pulled out a canteen, and handed it to her. "Drink slow," he said. Lydia drank like someone tasting water for the first time in her life. It stung her cracked lips, but she didn't care. When she looked up, Elias was building a small fire, his movements steady and practiced. He didn't talk much. Everything he did looked deliberate, quiet, patient, as if he'd spent years learning how not to waste words. He tore a loaf of bread in half and offered her the larger piece. She hesitated. "Why are you being kind to me?" He didn't meet her eyes. "It ain't kindness," he said simply. "It's just the right thing." She wanted to ask why a stranger would risk trouble for a girl everyone else had written off, but something in his tone stopped her. He wasn't doing this for praise. He was doing it because he couldn't stand not to. As night came down, the stars spilled out across the black sky. Lydia sat near the fire, her knees drawn up, watching the flames dance. She still didn't know who this man really was or what he wanted from her. Every man she'd known before had wanted something: labor, obedience, or silence. But Elias, he just sat there, carving a small horse from a piece of cedar. The sound of his knife against wood was soft, almost calming. She found herself whispering, "You're different." He gave a faint smile, still focused on the carving. "Don't go painting me into something I ain't," he said. "I just did what any man should have done." Lydia studied him, unsure if she believed that. The world she knew didn't have many men who did what they should have done. The firelight flickered over his face, strong lines, eyes that looked tired more than mean. She wondered who he'd been before the grief, before the loneliness she could almost feel radiating off him. When the silence grew too heavy, she asked quietly, "You ever lose someone?" He paused, the knife hovering midair. "Yeah," he said finally. "A long time ago." She nodded, understanding more than he probably realized. They were both people who'd had too much taken from them. Later, when the fire burned low, he tossed her a folded shirt from his pack. It was too big for her, but it smelled of smoke and soap, clean, familiar. For the first time in months, Lydia laughed under her breath, almost shy about the sound. Elias glanced at her, startled, then looked away quickly as if he didn't want her to see the faint curve of a smile tugging at his mouth. She lay back on the blanket he'd set out, staring up at the stars. The air felt different here, open, forgiving, maybe even hopeful. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "Maybe this is what being alive feels like." From across the fire, Elias said quietly, "Get some rest. Tomorrow we ride early." His voice was gruff, but gentle, like someone who'd forgotten how to sound kind but was trying to remember. Lydia nodded, though her eyes were already heavy. And for the first time in a long, long while, she slept without fear. Morning came soft and pale, with the kind of silence that only lives on the plains. The fire from the night before had burned down to ash, and the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. Lydia woke slowly, her cheek resting against the rough blanket, her body aching but warm. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that she wasn't in Dodge anymore. Elias was already up, crouched by the river, washing his hands. The light touched the edges of his face, and for the first time, she saw how worn he looked, not from age, but from the kind of life that didn't let a man rest. When he saw her stirring, he said, "There's coffee in the pot. It ain't good, but it's hot." She smiled faintly. "I don't remember what good coffee tastes like anyway." He nodded toward a small tin cup near the fire. She took it, her fingers trembling a little from the chill, and sat close to the flames. The first sip burned her tongue, but the warmth felt good, grounding. Elias packed his things with quiet precision. Every motion, folding a blanket, tightening a saddle strap, spoke of a man who'd learned to survive by keeping busy. Lydia watched him for a while, wondering what kind of grief made someone move like that. When he noticed her watching, he said without looking up, "Don't get used to silence. Out here, it's the first thing that'll fool you." "What do you mean?" He glanced toward the open plains. "Silence don't mean peace. Sometimes it's just what comes before trouble." She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she wanted to think about trouble anymore. By midday, they were riding again. The prairie rolled out ahead of them, golden grass bending in the wind like waves on a sea. Lydia had never seen land so wide. It made her feel small, but not the bad kind of small, the kind that reminds you the world is still bigger than your pain. Elias didn't talk much as they rode, but when he did, it was never idle. "You got people somewhere?" he asked. She hesitated. "Bad." He gave a quiet grunt, not prying further. That was something she liked about him. Most men asked too much, too soon. He gave her space, like he knew how heavy words could be. By the time the sun dipped low, they stopped near a small creek. Lydia knelt to wash her hands, and the water turned red with old dirt and dried blood. She stared at it for a long moment, the reflection of her face rippling in the current. She barely recognized herself anymore, thin, bruised, but somehow still standing. Elias came up behind her, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Don't look back too much. Out here, it's the surest way to lose your way." She nodded, blinking back tears she didn't want him to see. When they set camp again, he cooked beans over the fire, humming quietly to himself. Lydia found herself smiling just listening to it. The tune was rough, off-key, but it made the night feel less lonely. After they ate, she said, "You ever think about going back? To wherever home used to be?" Elias poked at the fire with a stick, the sparks rising like stars. "Home ain't always a place you can ride back to," he said. "Sometimes it's a person, and sometimes it's gone." His words sank deep, and for a while, neither of them spoke. The wind whispered through the grass, the fire cracked, and somewhere far off, a coyote called. Lydia looked up at the sky, full of stars that felt close enough to touch. "I don't know where I'll go when this ends," she said softly. Elias looked at her across the flames. "Then don't think about the end yet," he said. "Just think about the next mile." That night, the air turned colder. Lydia pulled the borrowed shirt tighter around her shoulders and listened to the steady rhythm of Elias's breathing from across the fire. For the first time, she didn't feel like property or prey. She felt seen, and though she didn't know it yet, that fragile sense of peace wouldn't last long. Somewhere behind them, the dust of Dodge City was already rising again, carrying the smell of revenge. For 2 days, the world around them stayed quiet, too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. The trail stretched on endlessly, the same dust, the same wind, the same feeling that something was watching from far behind. Lydia tried to convince herself it was just nerves, that the danger they'd left in Dodge had burned itself out. But deep down, she knew trouble never really died in places like that. It just took its time catching up. By late afternoon on the third day, they stopped near a creek lined with willows. Elias worked on the wagon wheel that had loosened on the rough trail, his hands steady despite the sweat and heat. Lydia knelt by the fire, boiling coffee in a dented tin pot. For the first time since he'd found her, it almost looked like peace. She could almost imagine they were just two ordinary people, travelers sharing a quiet evening on the plains. She glanced at him, his head bent over his work, jaw tight in focus. He didn't say much, but there was something about his presence that felt safe. The kind of safety she'd forgotten existed. She caught herself smiling, then quickly looked away, embarrassed by it. That's when the sound came, distant at first, then growing clearer. Hooves. More than one horse. Elias stopped what he was doing. His hand froze mid-turn on the wrench. He didn't need to look up. "Riders," he said quietly. Lydia's stomach tightened. She'd learned that word well. It never meant good news. The riders came into view, 3 of them, kicking up a storm of dust as they approached. The man in front wore a badge that caught the sunlight, a badge that once meant justice, but not anymore. "Afternoon, McKenna," the man called out, his voice easy and cruel. Elias stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. "Afternoon, deputy," he replied, calm but cold. Deputy Ward grinned, sliding off his horse. "Heard some talk back in Dodge," he said. "Heard you bought yourself a girl." Lydia froze, her heart hammering so loud she thought they'd hear it. She knew that tone. It was the same kind men used before deciding what a woman was worth. Ward's grin widened. "Got folks saying you paid $1 for her. Now, that's a hell of a deal." Elias's face didn't change. "You heard wrong." Ward laughed, taking a slow step closer. "Come on now. You know how this looks. You paid. She's yours. Law says property's got to be registered." His words dripped with mockery. Lydia's hands were shaking, but she couldn't stay quiet. "He didn't buy me," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "He bought my freedom." Ward turned his horse toward her, his smile fading. "You think anyone's going to believe that?" The air went still. Even the fire crackled quieter. Elias shifted slightly, his hand resting near his belt. Not threatening, just ready. Ward's eyes flicked down, noticing. His smirk faltered. "You really want to test that?" he asked. Elias's voice stayed low, controlled. "Law also says forgery's a hanja crime. You sure you want to keep talking?" The other two men behind Ward exchanged uneasy glances. They'd ridden enough trails to know when a man meant every word he said. Ward spat in the dirt, trying to reclaim his swagger. "You watch yourself, old man. Folks in Dodge don't like heroes. Next time I see you, I'll make sure that paper you carry don't mean a damn thing." He yanked the reins, turning his horse sharply. The three men rode off, laughter echoing behind them like a bad omen. When the dust finally settled, Lydia's knees gave out. She sank to the ground, the tin cup slipping from her fingers. "They'll come back," she whispered. Elias didn't answer right away. He stared at the horizon where the sun was sinking, blood-red and tired. "Yeah," he said finally, "they will." The coffee on the fire hissed as it boiled over, the smell sharp in the cooling air. Lydia hugged her knees to her chest, trying not to cry. Elias crouched near her, his voice rough but gentle. "You did good," he said, standing up like that. She shook her head. "I was scared." "Doesn't mean you weren't brave," he said. She looked at him, then really looked at him, the weathered lines, the quiet steadiness, the way he carried his grief like it was just another tool on his belt. For a man who'd lost so much, he still somehow found room for decency. That night, neither of them slept much. Every coyote howl made Lydia flinch. Every gust of wind felt like hooves. Elias sat by the fire, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost himself. "You ever notice how trouble don't need directions? It just finds you." Lydia looked up, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "Then maybe we don't stop moving," she said softly. He nodded. "Maybe we don't." And just like that, they both understood peace was only a pause out here, not a promise. By the third night, the air felt heavier, like the whole sky was waiting for something to break. The wind had changed direction, carrying the faint smell of rain and something sharper, gunpowder. Elias noticed it first. He didn't say a word, just tightened the straps on the wagon and checked his rifle. Lydia saw the way his hands moved, calm but tense, and her stomach dropped. They rode through Raton Pass, a narrow stretch of red rock and shadow that wound between Kansas and New Mexico. The path twisted like a snake, cliffs pressing close on both sides. Below them, the valley was black and endless, and the moon hadn't yet risen. Only the creak of the wagon wheels broke the silence. Lydia sat beside him, holding the reins tight, her eyes darting to every shadow. "Something's wrong," she whispered. Elias's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I feel it too." Then it came, the flicker of light on the ridge, like a spark in the dark. One light, then another, then three. Elias's voice was barely a whisper. "It's them." Lydia didn't have to ask who. Silas Boone had found them. The man who'd once tried to sell her for $1 now wanted revenge. And from the way the lights moved, he hadn't come alone. Elias pulled the reins hard. "Hold on." The horses lurched forward, hooves hammering against the rocky path. Bullets whined through the air, one splintering the backboard, another grazing Elias's arm. He didn't flinch. "Get down," he shouted. Lydia ducked, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. She reached for the rifle on the seat, hands shaking so bad she almost dropped it. "What do I do?" "Breathe," Elias said. "Then aim." She swallowed hard, braced the gun against her shoulder, and fired. The shot cracked through the canyon, echoing like thunder. Missed. She fired again. Sparks flew from the rocks near the ridge. The riders veered back, regrouping behind boulders. Elias used the moment to steer the wagon down toward the riverbed below. The horses stumbled, dirt flying, wheels screeching, but they made it down just as more bullets cut through the night. When the wagon hit level ground, Elias jumped off. "Go hide in the rocks," he yelled. "I'm not leaving you. Do as I say." Her chest tightened, but she ran. The ground was rough, sharp stones cutting into her feet. She crouched behind a cluster of rocks, clutching the rifle to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. The night smelled of dust, blood, and fear. Silas's voice echoed across the canyon. "You think you could take what's mine, old man?" Elias crouched behind the wagon, reloading. "Wasn't yours to take," he muttered. Lydia peeked through the smoke. She could see Silas's shape against the firelight, the cruel curve of his grin, the glint of his gun. Then something sparked near the wagon. A match. "Eli!" she screamed, but it was too late. Flames spread fast, licking up the dry grass. Elias grabbed a blanket and beat it down, but the smoke was too thick, blinding. The firelight painted the canyon red and gold, turning the air into heat and noise. Lydia's hands trembled, but she raised the rifle again. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Steady your breath. Don't rush your fear." She aimed through the haze, eyes stinging from smoke. "Please," she whispered, "make it quick." The gun fired. The sound tore through the canyon. Silas staggered back, surprise flashing across his face before he fell hard into the dirt. His men froze, then turned their horses and vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of hooves fading into silence. The fire died down slowly, smoke curling toward the stars. Lydia dropped the rifle and ran to Elias. He was on the ground, blood seeping through his sleeve, his breath shallow. She pressed her hands to the wound, tears spilling down her face. "You're not leaving me," she whispered. "Not now." He opened his eyes just enough to see her, and for a second he smiled, the kind of small, tired smile that meant more than any words. "You did good, kid," he murmured. "Told you you had fire in you." She laughed through her tears, shaking her head. "You're bleeding out, and you're still giving speeches." "Someone's gotta," he said weakly. Then, from somewhere in the canyon, came another sound. Not echoing hooves this time, steady ones. Controlled, the kind that meant lawmen. Lydia looked toward the ridge, fear tightening her chest again. "More riders," she whispered. Elias closed his eyes, voice fading. "Yeah, and this time they wore badges." The stars flickered above them like tiny fires. The night didn't feel safe anymore. Morning came slow and heavy, like the world had forgotten how to breathe. Smoke still hung in the air from the burned brush, curling through the canyon in thin gray ribbons. Lydia sat beside Elias, her fingers pressed to his sleeve, now stiff with dried blood. His face was pale, but he was alive. Every rise of his chest felt like a small miracle. She hadn't slept, hadn't dared to. The silence of the plains felt louder than gunfire. Each rustle of wind made her flinch, expecting more riders, more shouts, another fight she wasn't ready for. But there was only the wind and the low murmur of the river below, running dark and steady. When Elias finally stirred, she almost cried from relief. His eyes opened slowly, squinting against the light. "Still here?" he muttered. She let out a shaky laugh. "You think I'd let you die out here?" He managed a half-smile, weak but real. "Could have fooled me. You were the one doing all the shooting last night." She shook her head, wiping her eyes. "You taught me how to breathe, remember?" Elias chuckled softly, then winced as the pain caught him. "Yeah," he said, "and you learned fast." The moment lingered between them, raw, quiet, almost fragile. Lydia tore a strip from her skirt and wrapped it around his arm, careful not to meet his eyes. "You need a doctor," she said. "Need a miracle more than that," he muttered, but didn't fight her. As the sun climbed higher, she helped him to his feet, their movements slow and clumsy. They packed what little they had left and began the long walk toward Fort Union, where Elias said the marshal still kept the kind of law that hadn't yet rotted. Lydia stayed close, steadying him when he stumbled. Every time she looked at him, she felt something unfamiliar, fear, but also a strange, fierce loyalty. They reached the open plain by noon, the horizon wide and endless. Elias moved like a man running out of time, every step costing him more than he'd admit. Lydia wanted to tell him to stop, to rest, but she could see it in his eyes. He wouldn't. He needed to finish what he'd started. When they finally saw the fort rising out of the dust, she almost didn't believe it was real. The sight of the American flag fluttering in the wind made her chest ache. She hadn't seen one since before her father died. At the gates, two soldiers stopped them, rifles in hand. One of them frowned at Lydia's torn dress, at Elias's bloody sleeve. What happened here? Elias reached into his coat, pulling out the crumpled paper, the bill of sale Silas had signed in Dodge. "You best take this to your marshal," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. The soldier hesitated, then nodded and disappeared inside. Minutes later, a tall man in a worn uniform stepped out, the marshal himself. His face hardened when he saw the paper. He turned it over in his hands, his eyes narrowing. "Silas Boone," he said under his breath. "Haven't heard that name in a while. Used to run half the rustlers in New Mexico." He looked up at Elias. "You're saying you tried to sell her?" Elias nodded. In front of half of Dodge. The marshal's expression shifted, part disbelief, part something heavier, older. He folded the paper carefully. "That signature's all I need," he said. "I'll see that the right men hang for it." Lydia's breath caught. For the first time, she felt the weight of justice tipping in her favor. Elias stood a little straighter beside her, though he was still bleeding under his coat. The marshal glanced at her kindly. "You're safe now, miss. You've got your freedom, and the law back at this time." She looked at Elias, unsure what to say. The word free sounded strange in her mouth, like something too big to fit inside her. When they left the fort later that afternoon, the wind had shifted again, carrying the scent of grass and rain. Lydia walked beside Elias, their shadows long across the dirt road. Neither spoke for a while. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't cheapen what they'd survived. Finally, she whispered, "You could have left me back there. Would have been easier." Elias glanced at her, his voice low. "Maybe, but easier ain't always right." She smiled faintly, tears gathering again. "You really don't think I owe you anything?" He shook his head. "You don't owe me a damn thing. I paid $1 to stop a bad man, not to own a good soul." Her chest tightened. She looked down at the dirt, then back up at him. "You're not like anyone I've ever met." He smiled, small, tired but true. "Good. The world's already got enough of them." They kept walking as the light softened, the road stretching endlessly before them. For the first time in her life, Lydia didn't feel like she was running from something. She was walking toward it, whatever it was. And though the scars on her wrists still burned, they felt different now. Less like reminders of what she'd lost, and more like proof of what she'd survived. They left Fort Union with the sun at their backs, the road ahead wide and endless. The air smelled of rain and dust, a mix that promised change. Lydia walked beside Elias's horse, the hem of her skirt brushing the dry grass. Every now and then, she glanced up at him, his arms still bandaged, his face drawn but calmer now. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked like a man carrying something lighter than guilt. They didn't talk much. Words felt too small for what they'd been through. But there was a quiet understanding between them, like they'd both come from the same broken place and somehow ended up in the same small pocket of mercy. After a while, Lydia broke the silence. "You think they'll come after us again?" Elias took a slow breath, looking out across the plains. "Men like that don't quit easy," he said. "But I reckon they'll think twice now." She nodded, her fingers brushing the paper folded in her pocket, the one that bore Silas's signature. The same paper that had once been a bill of sale, but now stood as proof she belonged to no one. It felt strange, holding her freedom in her hands. Strange, but right. They camped that night, near a cluster of cottonwoods by the Cimarron River. The grass whispered in the wind, and the stars reflected off the water like broken glass. Elias built a small fire, careful with every movement. Lydia sat across from him, hugging her knees, watching the flames twist and curl. For a long time, neither spoke. Then she asked softly, "What will you do now?" He looked into the fire, his eyes distant. "Haven't thought that far ahead." "You don't have anywhere to go?" "Got land out near Cimarron. Haven't been back in years." He paused, rubbing his hands together. "Place went quiet after my wife passed. Thought maybe it was better that way." Lydia hesitated. "You loved her." Elias nodded slowly. "Still do. Some people don't leave, even when they're gone." Something in the way he said it made her throat tighten. She knew what it was to love someone who wasn't coming back. The fire crackled between them, warm and low. After a while, Elias handed her a folded piece of cloth from his pack. "You should have this." She unfolded it carefully. It was the shirt he'd lent her days ago, now cleaned, neatly folded. "You didn't have to." He shrugged. "Maybe not, but I wanted to." Her eyes stung. "You keep doing things for me, and I don't even know how to thank you." He leaned back, gazing at the stars. "You already did. You're still standing." That made her smile through the tears she didn't want him to see. When the fire died down to embers, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "You ever think people like us can really start over?" Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I think starting over ain't about forget. It's about not letting the past own you anymore." She nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. Maybe he was right. Maybe freedom wasn't something someone handed you. It was something you had to fight to keep believing in. They sat in silence for a while, the night stretching wide around them. A few coyotes howled in the distance, but the sound didn't scare her this time. It just reminded her they weren't alone in the world, that somewhere out there, other souls were surviving too. Elias added one last piece of wood to the fire. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be long." Lydia looked at him, the firelight flickering across his tired face. "You ever get tired of being the good man in a bad place?" He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Don't think I ever was a good man. Just one who got tired of watching bad ones win." She laid down, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. The stars were bright above her, so close, she thought she could touch them if she tried. Her last thought before sleep was simple but steady. Maybe I can start over too. And when morning came, she did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She saddled a horse herself. Elias watched her quietly, a hint of pride softening his face. "You ride pretty good for someone who swore she couldn't," he said. Lydia smirked. "Guess I just needed a reason." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got plenty now." The road ahead shimmered gold in the early light. They rode side by side, saying nothing because there was nothing left to explain. The past was behind them, the future somewhere up ahead. Uncertain, maybe dangerous, but finally theirs to choose. For the first time, Lydia didn't feel like someone's possession or someone's burden. She felt human, alive, herself. By the time the sun rose on the fourth day, the plains were washed in gold. The storm that had threatened never came. Instead, the sky cleared wide and blue, stretching forever. Lydia rode alongside Elias, her hair loose in the wind, the sound of hooves steady and calm beneath them. Every mile they crossed felt like shedding a piece of who they used to be. They reached a small ridge overlooking the valley. Below them, the land rolled out like an ocean of grass, dotted with wildflowers and the faint shimmer of distant rivers. It was quiet, peaceful in a way neither of them had known for a long time. Elias stopped his horse, looking out over it all. "Haven't seen it look this good in years," he said softly. Lydia smiled. "Guess we both got a little lucky." He chuckled low. "Lucky ain't the word I'd use, but I'll take it." They rode down toward a shallow stream where the air smelled of rain and earth. Elias climbed off his horse, his movements still slow from the wound, and started gathering stones to build a small fire. Lydia helped him, her hands moving without needing direction. They worked in silence, the kind that felt warm and full instead of heavy. When the fire was going, Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "This belongs to you," he said. She took it carefully. It was the same paper that had started everything. The sale document, Silas Boone's signature scrawled at the bottom. But now it meant something entirely different. She traced her fingers over the ink. "This piece of paper says I was worth $1." He shook his head. "No, it says the world tried to put a price on you and failed." Lydia's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. She folded the paper again and held it to her chest like it was something sacred. "No one ever wrote my name on anything before," she whispered. "Not for something good, anyway." Elias smiled, faint but proud. "Well, now they did. And you keep it, to remember what you survived." They sat there for a while, watching the fire flicker, listening to the water run over stones. Lydia thought about all the things that had brought her here, the laughter and dodge, the dust, the fear, the blood, the long nights of silence. Every bit of it had led to this one still moment where she finally felt whole. After a while, she turned to him. "Where will you go now?" Elias shrugged. "Wherever I'm needed, I guess. The world's still got places that need fixin'." She nodded slowly, thinking, "Then maybe I'll ride with you." For a while. He raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" She smiled, that small, brave smile that had taken her weeks to find. "If you'll have me." He looked at her for a long second, then laughed. A real, quiet laugh that sounded like it hadn't seen daylight in years. Wouldn't want it any other way. They packed up their things as the sun climbed higher. Lydia saddled her horse herself this time, tying her braid with a strip of cloth torn from her old dress. She looked different now, not just freer but stronger. There was something steady in her eyes, something that said she'd stopped waiting for someone else to save her. As they rode west, the wind swept through the grass, bending it in waves around them. The world ahead was wide, uncertain, and full of promise. After a while, Elias spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You know, people always try to tell you what you're worth. They'll measure it in money, in mistakes, in scars." He glanced at her. "Don't ever let them decide your price." Lydia met his eyes, smiling through the sting in her throat. "I won't." He nodded once. "Good. Then maybe you'll do better than the rest of us." They rode on in silence after that, two silhouettes against the sky painted in fire and light. The road stretched ahead, empty, endless, full of second chances. For Lydia, freedom wasn't a gift anymore. It was a choice, something she'd earned with every mile, every scar, every heartbeat that refused to give up. And for Elias, it was the proof that even in a world gone mean and cold, decency still mattered. Sometimes it only took $1. Sometimes it took everything. But it was always worth it. When the sun dipped low and the horizon caught flame, Lydia turned to him and said softly, "You think peace is real? Out here?" Elias smiled. "If we keep riding, maybe we'll find it." And they did what people with hope always do in the West. They kept going. Two souls once broken by the world, riding side by side toward the kind of tomorrow that could only belong to the brave. Because in the end, the story wasn't about being bought or saved. It was about learning what freedom truly costs, and realizing that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change the course of a life forever.